Developing the knight here prepares for king's Indian or ready setups, subtly challenging central control without immediate commitment. Mirroring white's knight development, black immediately contests central influence and prepares for dynamic counterplay. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop, aiming for kingside pressure and solid pawn structure. The pawn to g6 solidifies the kingside's fianchetto structure, preparing for a bishop's active diagonal presence and reinforcing the central control. Developing the bishop to g2 creates a picturesque fianchetto, eyeing the long diagonal and bolstering the kingside structure. A solid fianchetto mirrors white's setup, preparing for central influence and a safe haven for the king. Securing the monarch initiates a common endgame scenario, preparing to connect the rooks for future play. Black boldly stakes a central claim, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially initiate a dynamic pawn battle. Establishing a solid pawn chain and preparing to develop the queen's bishop offers white good central control. Securing the king further solidifies black's setup, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potential queenside expansion. Establishing a flexible knight outpost, ready to support a central pawn push or a kingside advance while keeping the c-file open. Bringing the knight to its natural square, this maneuver prepares for central pawn expansion and connects the rooks. Unleashing central dynamism, white boldly stakes a claim for space and initiative, aiming to fracture black's pawn structure. Striking at the center, black liberates the queen's diagonal and forces white to make a decision about pawn structure. Opening the center now simplifies the position, potentially leading to a more open game where piece activity becomes paramount. Black immediately contests the center, seizing crucial space and inviting a pawn confrontation that will shape the ensuing middle game dynamics. Repositioning the rook clears the e-file for a central pawn push and supports the knight's advance, creating a dynamic central structure. Reinforcing the center's pawn structure now prepares for future pawn advances and central control. Solidifying the center and preparing a queenside expansion, this move shores up the pawn structure. Fortifying the knight for a potential advance to the e5 square, while also preparing to support the central pawn structure. Unveiling the queen to support the central pawn push and eye potential kingside weaknesses creates immediate dynamic tension. Pouncing the knight to c5 aggressively contests the central square and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure. Repositioning the bishop to f1 clears the e-file and prepares for a kingside pawn push, aiming to restrict black's central influence. Black seeks to expand on the queenside, potentially opening lines for the rook. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure while preparing to potentially expand on the flank. Launching an aggressive pawn thrust, black boldly challenges the center and opens lines for the dark-squared bishop, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development. Unleashing a bishop's diagonal attack, white forces black's king into a defensive posture while preparing for an aggressive pawn thrust. Seeking a safe haven, the king retreats, a prudent maneuver given the impending pawn storm and open diagonals. Opening the a-file to pressure black's queenside pawns initiates a dynamic queenside initiative. Reclaiming the bishop from the pin, black subtly improves its scope and prepares to contest the central files. Exchanging that bishop on f7 suddenly opens a clear diagonal for your rook to potentially dominate the file. Repositioning the rook to a more passive square, seemingly preparing to double on the open e-file, but it might hinder development. Sacrificing material to expose the king's flank is a daring, aggressive gamble aiming for a swift checkmate. Opening the h-file creates dynamic counterplay, but sacrifices structural integrity around your king. Sacrificing development for a clear path to the doubled pawns, inviting a structural imbalance that might prove exploitable later. Reclaiming the c5 square with the rook forces a reassessment of the bishop pair's dominance. Clearing lines of sight across the center opens up attacking potential, particularly targeting the weakened kingside structure. Reclaiming the queen in this tangled position opens up the h-file for potential king pressure. The knight repositions to a central outpost, eyeing potential attacks on black's weakened kingside and aiming to control key squares. The rook's relocation to the 7th rank aims to contest the open file and disrupt white's pawn structure, a necessary defensive maneuver. Liberating the e-file unleashes immense attacking potential, directly targeting black's uncastled king. Recapturing the bishop opens diagonals and initiates a fight for central control that will define the middle game. Repositioning the queen to eye the d-file offers a chance to exploit black's weakened kingside pawn structure. Opening the e-file offers a tempting pathway, but consider the exposed nature of your king should the center collapse. Knight boldly ventures forward, probing the king's side and potentially creating mating threats. Focusing the queen on the king side is a clever attempt to disrupt white's attacking setup and offer tactical chances. Shifting the queen to an active square, this aims to pry open black's position and exploit the exposed king. Restoring the rook to an active file aims to disrupt white's imposing queen and knight battery. Clearing the d-file now allows the rooks to become active participants and potentially target black's weakened kingside pawn structure. The rook finds a more active post, preparing to contest the open file and press against the weakened kingside. Capturing the knight opens the g-file, creating dynamic pressure against black's still exposed king. Unlocking the f-file for immediate counterplay against white's central pawn structure. Asserting dominion over the 5th rank, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's queenside stability and potentially exploit the weakened g6 pawn. A bold sacrifice aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure, though it might leave the king exposed. Reasserting central control, this redeployment prepares to contest the now open d-file, creating pressure on black's exposed queenside. Unleashing the queenside pawns aims to fracture white's central pawn structure and open critical lines for piece activity. Targeting the weak d6 pawn with this knight repositions it for potential kingside assault, opening lines for attackers. The knight boldly ventures to e7, eyeing potential outpost squares and reinforcing the queenside pawn structure under duress. Sharpening the assault on the weakened kingside, this move aims to pry open the 7th rank for a decisive invasion. Exploiting the open queen's file, a bold attempt to disrupt white's central dominance and gain counterplay. Seizing the open c-file now pierces black's weakened pawn structure, creating immediate threats. Unveiling a surprise attack on the d7 pawn, black aims to destabilize white's central control. A decisive opening of the file, threatening to unravel black's defenses and create immediate attacking opportunities. Sensing the open files, black aims to consolidate his king's position before further complications arise on the board. Repositioning the rook to d7 aims to solidify the d-file control and potentially set up threats against black's weakened kingside pawn structure.